In possessions, you're gonna see the manifestation in different ways of an evil spirit. Sometimes that spirit will take over the consciousness of the person, will even speak in a slightly different tone of voice.
Hmm.
Remember, they're using the body of the victim, so they're actually using the person's vocal cords.
Hmm.
They're going to sound a little bit like that, but they also clearly will seem like it's a foreign personality. Eventually, you often also see or get reports of seeing signs of um, the lay public calls it the paranormal. We would call it the preternatural, things beyond the natural ability of a human being. For instance,
Okay.
the criteria are speaking a foreign language all of a sudden that the person never studied, exhibiting superhuman strength of some sort. I dealt with a woman once who was possessed, and she was being exorcised by her Protestant deacon, who was kind of inexperienced, and they didn't hold her down. And when the prayers started, she jumped up. She took the guy. She was 90 pounds soaking wet. She took this 200-pound guy and threw him across the church hall. That
Hmm.
sort of ended things very quickly in that session. But that strength was obviously beyond the human. And then a third major criteria they call in Latin latra, Laetra. It's sort of the revelation of hidden knowledge that the person would have no reason for believing.
Hmm.
One of the more dramatic cases that I dealt with who was possessed, I call her Julia. She could tell me a lot of this hidden knowledge. For instance, she told me once how my mother had died much years earlier of ovarian cancer, but she also told me
Hmm.
all kinds of things. In fact, she also had a number of other preternatural or paranormal abilities. She had what the parapsychologists call remote viewing. When you deal with spiritualists and channelers and that sort of thing, these people will often say, "Well, I was born gifted,"
Hmm.
and there probably are some spiritually gifted people. Having said that, Sean, she was very blunt. She said, "Nobody is born gifted. I get these powers through Satan." And I said, "Why do you think Satan gives you those powers?" In this case, this was one of these rare, genuine Satanists who worshipped the devil and also received these powers. Unfortunately, at the same time, she became possessed, which she was well aware of. You will often get an individual who is not particularly hostile to religion or something, but when the evil spirit manifests itself, the
Hmm.
evil spirit is incredibly not only hostile but afraid of sacred things.
Hmm.
Um, but the background of victims is varies a little bit. But on the other hand, they usually have made some kind of turn in their life that is very unwise. They've either turned to something of a serious nature, occultic or dark. Obviously, in Julia's case, it was Satanism, but other people turn to lesser degrees of witchcraft or some type of slightly dark spiritualism or something. Uh, and at the same time, many of them, or independently, people turn to very sinful or evil practices. In
Hmm.
some ways, they have invited, either directly or indirectly, they have invited, again, with a possession, they have invited the evil spirit in. So,
Hmm.
for instance, in Julia's case, it was very obvious. She worshipped Satan. She thought she was getting a lot out of it, but it was literally what we call a Faustian bargain. She got much
Wow.
more than she bargained for. In another case, I write about a book. I write about a guy who was a criminal, and he was kind of a drug kingpin of sorts. And he had turned to a Mexican occult cult called Santa Muerte.
Hmm.
and he was a pretty nasty guy. He was eventually imprisoned for his crimes, and the chaplain at the prison found that he was possessed. He did eventually get help, but obviously in his case, probably even more than his involvement with the occult, which was a factor, was the fact that he had led such an evil criminal life.
Hmm.
So in the worst cases, that's what you often see. In cases of oppression, it's different. You don't necessarily see somebody who's horribly involved in evil, but they usually have dabbled in occultism or something like that.
Hmm.
Usually some reason that they have these more minor um, harassment or oppression by a demon. And exorcism, sometimes they want the magic formula to relieve them of a demonic attack, but it's always more complicated than that because the victim has to turn to God, has to reform their life. For instance, again, using Julia's case as an example, she was this literal Satan worshiping priestess. She called herself of a cult. Even though these cults are rare, she was the real deal. But she never really agreed, despite the priest being generous enough to do exorcisms with her at her request. She never was really willing to reform her life or leave the cult, in part because she was afraid of the cult. And so she was never delivered. So, as opposed to this gangster I mentioned, who, after this serious possession, he returned to his practice. He was an Hispanic man who returned to his practice in the Catholic Church, reformed his life, and he was eventually delivered.